explain in a nutshell, how do you know my mother? Explain to me the circumstances under which you began to know her.
I first met Avital Sagalyn in 1975 when she was on the search committee that interviewed me for the job as the founding director of what was then the University Gallery at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, now named the University Museum of Contemporary Art. And at the time, she was obviously a very articulate, not intense, but very engaged, warm person. And I felt very comfortable in her presence. And she continued to serve on the advisory council to the University Gallery for the 8 years that I directed the gallery. And I always appreciated her thoughtful responses and her very supportive attitude and her clear knowledge and passion for art.
And at the time, you knew she was an artist, but you didn't really know anything about her work. Tell me about that.
Well, when I first met her, she was introduced as an artist, and she basically said, you know, I don't make art anymore. I'm sort of a former artist. It was more the implication. And she was very reticent to talk about her work or talk about her past. Since reading the catalog from her exhibition at the UMass exhibition, I've learned so much more about her, and would love to go back and have the chance to chat with her about her life as an artist. I mean, she winning a full scholarship to Cooper Union at the time she did in the 40s was a very difficult accomplishment. Very few people had that opportunity. And then being one of the first women to win a Fulbright as a painter, to travel to Europe, to Paris. I mean, these are all extremely difficult hurdles to pass that she was able to do, and her work from that time is extremely advanced. It's very much on the cutting edge of art in not just in Europe, but anywhere in the world at that time. Extremely accomplished artist, and as a young artist, great potential and sort of wise beyond her years in terms of her achievement as a painter.
I remember you told me the story about how you didn't ask to look at her work because if you went to the house and you saw her work and you didn't think it was very good, then you'd be embarrassed and that you'd have to say something nice. You'd be in an awkward position. Tell me that story. It's a wonderful story.
When you hear somebody's an artist, you never know what that means. It could mean that they're a Sunday painter, or they just dabble, or that somebody's a very serious, accomplished artist. And as you can imagine, when you do studio visits, it's really within the first 3 to 5 minutes you realize whether you have interest in the artist's work and whether it's going to be a promising visit. But you always stay for at least an hour, if not 90 minutes, because you don't want to be rude or in any way dismissive of the artist. So when an artist is reluctant to have you come and see their work, you don't really press that if you don't know the work at all, if you've never seen anything. And I'd never seen anything of Avital's work, so I didn't sort of push and say, you know, let me just come by and have a quick peek. I won't be in your house for more than 20 minutes. But so as I say, it was in some sense a relief when I suggested coming to see her work, and she was sort of rejecting the idea of having me come by. But I deeply regret that I wasn't more insistent, because I would have discovered a great talent at a time when I would have been in a position to present an exhibition of her work at the University Gallery.
So what is it about her work that you saw at UMass that most impressed you?
Well, Avital had clearly absorbed lessons from studying the art of Turner for light, Cubism from Cezanne and from Picasso. I sensed she'd looked at Braque and others. But she had a very unique take of her own. There are studies of Notre Dame Cathedral where she's not just portraying it as we see it as architecture, but absorbing the complete effect of being in the space around the cathedral, incorporating not only the light, but the sound of the water, of the river, just as she puts it, getting the full effect. And I was very impressed by the fact that she would continue to repaint Notre Dame different times of day, different times of year, different light conditions. As she says, not repeating herself, but re-imaging it until she captured its essence. And I think in some of those paintings, on multiple occasions, she captured the essence, which only a great painter can do.
Any other paintings that made an impression on you? I remember you talked about Maine and the rocks.
There are many. There's a wonderful drawing of the wharfs in Provincetown, which I think is an extraordinary drawing. She also did studies of rocks in Monhegan. She spent time in Booth Bay Harbor with Carl Nessiar. And I was a graduate student at Princeton when he built the Picasso that was in front of the art department for many years.
And any other pieces?
Avital traveled extensively to the south of France and met there with Chagall and visited his studio and did these extraordinary paintings of a village that had been essentially abandoned in the south of France. She also traveled to Israel and made wonderful paintings of mosques and churches in Israel. Again, the very sophisticated use of color and line and capturing the light of Israel, which she described as even harsher than the light of the south of France. And there are studies from the mid-50s of a lobster, which is just almost a frightening series of drawings. This lobster looks so predatory and ominous and threatening. And I love the fact that once she had drawn the lobster, she refused to eat it because she said it would be like cannibalism. She was so intimate with this creature by that point.
So how do you see Avital fitting into the broader narrative of young women artists in the 40s and 50s, only a few of whom went on to show in museums? How does Avital fit into that scene?
Avital was obviously very well situated thanks to her background with the Fulbright and with Cooper Union. And she was on first-name basis with a number of the most important artists of the 40s and 50s. But she was very reluctant to show her work. She felt that the obligation to make work for a date for an exhibition would impinge on her natural creativity or the natural evolution of her work. And it would be interesting to kind of push back a little bit and find out if it was a reluctance to meet her audience or a certain insecurity that perhaps it wouldn't be well received if she exhibited. But it's a great shame that someone didn't twist her arm to get her to exhibit her work earlier, because it would have been a very encouraging experience for her. And most importantly, her work would be far better known than it is today had she accepted the opportunities of some of these exhibitions in New York.
How much of it could it have been that she was a woman and versus a man, where a man would have said, sure, see my work, and a woman, they're not as ambitious, they're not as self-confident. Could that have been an issue, a factor?
A huge issue for women painting in the 40s and 50s was it was very much a man's world and a man's macho attitude. Artists like Jackson Pollock and de Kooning and others were almost like cowboys in their uncouthness and their uncavalier-like attitude to women. So you'd be very much swimming against the current as a woman artist at that time in New York City. And it would have taken a very heroic leap to overcome the insecurities or the reluctance to exhibit. I can see why a very talented, strong artist wouldn't have the confidence to move forward being a woman in that company of macho men.
And if you look at her work, how does it compare to that of her contemporaries?
I think Avital's work from the late 40s and the early 50s, when she was only shortly out of Cooper Union, a very young artist in her 20s and early 30s, was on a par with a lot of the very best artists making work both in Paris and in New York at that time. She was breaking new ground in her atmospheric paintings that combined Cubism with lessons learned, as I was saying, from Turner in terms of light, and also from the Impressionists. But it was a kind of abstraction that was always rooted in the real world. So it was more her subjective record of what she was seeing, which incorporated emotion and perception and phenomenology in a way that was very refined and very appealing.
So some say the odds are stacked against someone like my mother, who, in terms of getting widely recognized now, because her works were from the 40s and 50s and reminiscent of an earlier period and not with the current trend. Do you agree with that perspective, and why is that the case or not the case?
Well, the art world in recent years has acknowledged its oversights to women artists and to artists of color. And there's a real resurgence of interest in these artists who were overlooked at the time, and going back and re-looking at the work and putting it in context, we're discovering new artists.
Some have noted that Avital mastered a number of different paintings and drawing styles and techniques. Do you see a thread running through them? Do you see a broad range of strength or liability for an artist?
Looking at Avital's work in retrospect, you can see many different styles and many different materials. She made sculpture, she made drawings, she designed wonderful fabrics, fabric designs that could be used for scarves or clothing. And throughout that work, there is a consistent vision, a consistent sensibility that's very much Avital's, but it manifested itself in all these different media and different palette and different line because of her experimental nature and her curiosity of seeing the world in different ways. And I see that as a great asset for an artist. I mean, for many years, artists were encouraged by their dealers to stick with one identifiable style because it made it easier to market and to sell and to brand. But the best artists couldn't possibly be constricted in that way. They had to experiment. And Avital is very much of that nature, of needing to grow and evolve and work in different ways and in different media.
Anything else I should ask you?
One of the things that nags at me is, had I been in a position to show her work in the 70s, would that have encouraged her to make more art and to get back in the studio? And that haunts me, that, you know, this is an individual of extraordinary talent who walked away from her studio when she should have been pursuing her vision and growing and evolving in a way that lived up to her extraordinary early promise and accomplishment.
There is quite a bit of work actually in the 70s and 80s and 90s, not as much as in the 40s and 50s, but there is a bit. I've got lots of archival boxes of it. It's just that, you know, the exhibition at UMass could only show a certain amount. And there's a lot of material there for other shows for her later work, actually.
Well, there's some paintings that you know of the Église Madeleine and of the of San Marco in Venice, which are very good, very good. And as an artist, you don't lose your facility, you don't lose your touch, and your vision evolves. So it's unlike the sciences where people tend to have breakthroughs at an early age. I mean, being an artist or a musician, the talent just accumulates, and the facility and the prowess just evolves in a way that artists often get stronger as they age.